We're taught that the truth will set you free. But for a select few, exposing the truth is exactly what got them erased. Today, we're covering the 10 most shocking cases of whistleblowers who vanished after uncovering dark secrets. These are the stories powerful shadow agencies desperately want buried. If you love deep dives into the unexplained, please hit that subscribe button and give hype points. Now, close your blinds, watch your back, and let's begin. It's May 8th, 1996, on a lonely dirt road outside El Reno, Oklahoma, flat, dusty farm country about 40 miles west of Oklahoma City. There's a car parked out there, abandoned near a thin grove of trees, and when sheriff's deputies look inside, they find a grim, devastating scene. But there's no body in the car. The man it belongs to is found later, more than a mile away, lying in a rough open field, having sustained massive fatal trauma, including a final gunshot wound. And the official ruling on this gruesome, sprawling, catastrophic scene? Self-inflicted death, done in a matter of hours with no real homicide investigation at all. The man in that field was Sergeant Terrence Yeakey. And to understand why so many people refuse to believe he killed himself, you have to go back almost exactly 1 year to the worst day in Oklahoma's history. Let's talk about Terry Yeakey, 30 years old, a sergeant with the Oklahoma City Police Department, a military veteran, and by every account, a giant of a man, physically imposing, strong, the kind of presence that fills a room. But he wasn't a bruiser. He was beloved. He taught the DARE anti-drug program to local kids. He was the cop parents wanted their children to meet. And on April 19th, 1995, Terry Yeakey became a hero. That was the morning a truck bomb tore the face off the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including children in the daycare. It was at the time the worst act of domestic terrorism in American history, and Terry Yeakey was one of the very first officers on the scene. He didn't hesitate. He ran straight into that shattered, collapsing building and started pulling people out of the rubble. He saved at least 4 lives. At one point, carrying a survivor, he fell through 2 unstable floors and badly injured his back. He was a genuine hero. The department wanted to give him its highest honor, the Medal of Valor. But here's where the story turns, because Terry Yeakey did not want that medal. Now, this is where it gets strange. While the rest of the country was processing the tragedy and accepting the official account, a lone anti-government extremist named Timothy McVeigh, 1 truck, 1 bomb, Terry Yeakey couldn't accept it. And it started on day 1. After he was treated at the hospital for his back, his ex-wife Tonya picked him up. And in the car, this huge, strong man broke down crying. He told her, "It's not what they're saying it is. They're not telling the truth. They're lying about what's going on down there." Remember, this is a first responder, a trained observer, a cop who was inside that building with his own eyes and his own hands. And what he saw at the scene didn't match what the government was telling the public. So Terry did something brave and dangerous. He started his own private investigation. Quietly, over the following months, he compiled a dossier, witness statements, photographs, his own observations, evidence that, in his mind, pointed to something much bigger than 1 man and 1 truck. Foreknowledge, a cover-up, the possibility of additional explosives. He became convinced the official story was a lie, and he was gathering the proof. And as he gathered it, he got scared. Really scared. He told family he believed he was being followed, and he did something that, in hindsight, is chilling. He asked Tonya to remarry him, not out of rekindled romance, but, in his words, in the event that something happens to him. He wanted her to have the legal standing to fight for answers. Think about that. A 30-year-old man quietly arranging his affairs because he believes he's about to die. Which brings us to May of 1996. Terry was scheduled to receive the Medal of Valor on May 9th, and instead of being proud, he was distressed, agitated. He did not want to stand on a stage and be paraded as a hero for an event he believed was being covered up. The day before that ceremony, May 8th, his blood-soaked car was found abandoned on that dirt road in El Reno, and his body was found over a mile away, out in the field. The scene was catastrophic. He had sustained massive fatal trauma from multiple sources, culminating in a final gunshot wound. The interior of the vehicle showed signs of severe blood loss. The field was where he was found dead. And almost immediately, the authorities ruled it a self-inflicted death. The explanation offered was that Yiki, suffering from PTSD and survivor's guilt over the people he couldn't save and going through a hard time personally, took his own life. Okay, stop. Let's actually walk through what that theory requires us to believe, step by step, because when you lay it out, it collapses. Here is the official sequence. Terry Yiki sits in his car. He inflicts severe catastrophic injuries upon himself. He is rapidly losing consciousness, soaking the inside of the vehicle. Then, while rapidly losing consciousness from catastrophic injuries, he supposedly opens the door, gets out of the car, and walks. Not a few steps, over a mile, across rough, uneven farmland. And then, after that mile-long journey, he produces a gun and shoots himself in the head. Read that again. Does that sound like any self-inflicted death you've ever heard of? Let's be blunt about the biology. When you inflict that level of catastrophic trauma on yourself to the point of soaking the vehicle, you don't go for a hike. You collapse. The blood loss alone would drop most people within minutes, often within yards. The idea that a man could inflict that level of trauma on himself and then march over a mile through a field before delivering a final gunshot isn't despair. It's not even physically realistic. That's not a man ending his life. That reads like a man being moved and finished off somewhere else. And the gunshot itself raises the same flag. Independent researchers who looked at the case, including a former police officer named Craig Roberts, pointed to the trajectory of that fatal bullet. The path of the wound was downward. Downward. Think about how you shoot yourself in the head. The angle tends to go up or level. A downward trajectory is far more consistent with someone standing over a kneeling man and firing down. That's not a self-inflicted death angle. That's an execution angle. But here's the detail that, for me, breaks the official story completely. The marks on his body. Yiki wasn't just cut. According to the accounts that emerged, he had ligature marks, the kind of marks you get from being bound or restrained. He had bruises, and his wounds had clumps of dirt and grass packed deep inside them, suggesting he'd been beaten and dragged across the ground. Now, apply the logic. How does a man who is allegedly alone in his car, inflicting dozens of puncture wounds upon himself, end up with ligature marks like he'd been tied or restrained? How do you get bruised and dragged across a field by yourself? You can't give yourself the marks of being bound while your hands are supposedly inflicting fatal catastrophic trauma to yourself. Those marks mean other hands were involved. Other people. He was restrained, he was beaten, he was moved. And then there's the dossier. Remember the box of evidence, a year's worth of witness statements and photographs that Terry had been quietly compiling. The thing he was scared enough about that he was getting his affairs in order? After his death, it was gone. His apartment was searched. His sister Lashin noticed someone had clearly been through it, looking for specific things. A VCR and belongings vanished from his ex-wife's home around the same time. The single most valuable, most dangerous thing Terry Yiki owned, the evidence that made him a threat, disappeared the very day he did. So let me ask you the obvious question. If Terry simply wanted to end his own life because of trauma and grief, what happened to the files? A suicidal man doesn't arrange to have his own evidence box professionally extracted from his apartment after his death. Somebody wanted that dossier gone, and the only reason to take it is because of what was inside it. And it gets worse when you look at how the investigation itself was handled. The body was found in El Reno, which is its own jurisdiction. But the Oklahoma City Police Department moved in fast, cordoned off the scene, and effectively took over, pushing aside the local authorities. For the suspicious death of an active duty officer, a man with multiple slashing wounds and a gunshot, there was no real homicide investigation. There was no final note. And astonishingly, the state medical examiner, Dr. Fred Jordan, never even performed a full autopsy. The death was classified, sealed, and buried as a self-inflicted death with stunning speed. A police officer dies covered in stab wounds and a bullet hole, and nobody does an autopsy. That's not how you treat a self-inflicted death. That's how you make a problem disappear. And to widen the lens just a little, Yeke's death didn't happen in isolation. A couple of months later, in July 1996, a man named Richard Guthrie, a figure connected to a white supremacist group some investigators have linked to the broader Oklahoma City bombing network, was found hanged in his jail cell just before he was reportedly going to talk. People who knew too much about what really happened in Oklahoma City had an unsettling way of turning up dead. So where does this leave us? The official record still says self-inflicted death. But Terry Yeke's family has never accepted it. For decades now, they have fought to have the case reopened, convinced that he was murdered, tortured for the location of his evidence, and then executed in a field to protect the official version of the worst day in Oklahoma's history. And honestly, when you line it all up, the impossible mile-long walk after a neck injury, the downward bullet path, the ligature marks, the dirt packed into his wounds, the vanished dossier, the jurisdictional takeover, the autopsy that never happened, it gets very hard to call that a self-inflicted death with a straight face. Sergeant Terrence Yeke ran headfirst into a collapsing building, through fire and dust and falling concrete, to save the lives of people he'd never met. He was, by any honest definition, a hero, but it wasn't the rubble that killed him. It was what he believed was buried underneath it, the secret he was trying to drag into the light. And the day before they were going to pin a medal on his chest, that secret cost him everything. It's the height of summer, August 2010, in Pimlico, one of the quiet, expensive corners of central London. Up on the top floor of a building, there's an apartment. And this isn't just any apartment, it's a government safe house, vetted and secured, reserved for intelligence personnel. Inside, the central heating has been cranked to its absolute maximum, in the middle of a heat wave. The flat is oven-hot, dark, sealed. And in the ensuite bathroom, sitting neatly inside the bathtub, there's a red North Face sports bag. Zipped shut, padlocked. And inside that bag, curled up, is the body of one of the most brilliant codebreakers Britain ever produced. This is the case they call the spy in the bag. And I promise you, the longer you look at it, the less sense it makes. Let's talk about the man in the bag first. His name was Gareth Williams, 31 years old. And Gareth wasn't a field agent or some action movie spook. He was a mathematician, a genuine prodigy. The kind of mind that finished a maths degree as a teenager and saw patterns in numbers the rest of us can't even perceive. He worked for GCHQ, that's Britain's Signals Intelligence Agency, basically the UK's version of the NSA. And at the time of his death, he'd been seconded over to MORAP Wire 6, the secret intelligence service, working out of their London headquarters. So what was he actually doing? This is where it gets interesting. Gareth was a cyber specialist, and his job involved tracking dark money, following the digital trails of dirty cash through the financial networks of Russian organized crime, transnational cartels, state-level money laundering. He had extreme security clearance. He had access to systems most people on Earth will never even hear the names of. And there were whispers, reports that he'd been running unusual, unauthorized queries on a sensitive database, that he was mapping how cash moved across continents, and darker rumors still, that he may have stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to. A leak. Maybe even a double agent inside the agency. We also know this. Not long before he died, Gareth had asked to transfer back to GCHQ in Cheltenham. He'd cited friction at the MI6 London office. Read that however you want, but a top codebreaker quietly asking to get out of a posting is not nothing. Okay, so now the timeline, and the timeline is genuinely bizarre from the very first beat. In mid-August 2010, Gareth Williams simply drops off the grid. He stops showing up. He misses work. He fails to log into the secure MI6 systems. For an ordinary employee, fine, maybe you assume they took a holiday. But Gareth wasn't an ordinary employee. He was a Tier 1 asset holding live state secrets in his head. And here's the first thing that should stop you cold. MI6, one of the most sophisticated intelligence agencies on the planet, waited and waited. For something like a week, nobody raised the alarm. Nobody sent someone to knock on his door. A man with that clearance vanishes, goes completely silent, stops logging into classified systems, and the response from the agency is nothing. For days. Finally, on the 23rd of August, colleagues report him missing. Police force entry into the safe house, and inside, everything is unnervingly tidy. No signs of a break-in, no signs of a struggle. Nothing knocked over, nothing broken. Just that brutal, sweltering heat, the heating turned up full blast in August. And in the bathroom, the red North Face holdall sitting in the tub. They open it, and Gareth is inside. Now here is the detail that has baffled investigators, forensic scientists, and frankly, the entire world ever since. The bag was padlocked from the outside, a brass padlock threaded through the zips, locked shut. And the key to that padlock? It was found inside the bag, underneath his body. Let that sink in for a second, and it gets worse, or stranger. When forensic teams went over that bathroom, they found nothing. 0 fingerprints on the bag, 0 on the padlock, 0 on the rim of the bathtub. No usable trace DNA in the bathroom at all. It was, in the words of investigators, a forensic vacuum. A scene wiped utterly, impossibly clean. So let's stop the story right here and apply some logic, because the official explanation is where this case goes from tragic to absurd. For a long stretch, Scotland Yard floated the theory that Gareth did this to himself, that he climbed into that bag on his own, possibly as some kind of solitary escapology stunt or sexual experiment, and accidentally locked himself inside and perished. A horrible, lonely accident. Okay, let's actually walk through the physics of that. Slowly, you're Gareth. You get into a sports bag. Now, from inside that bag, you have to reach out and pull the 2 zippers all the way closed, sealing yourself in. Fine, awkward, but maybe. But then you have to take a padlock, thread it through the 2 external zipper pulls on the outside of the bag, and click it shut. From the inside, through the fabric, blind. And then, this is the kicker, you have to take the key and pull it back through the sealed, padlocked, microscopic gap in the zipper teeth into the bag with you and end up lying on top of it. How? How does any human being do that? Forensic investigators didn't just doubt it, they actually tried. Experts attempted to lock themselves into an identical bag from the inside, over and over, hundreds of attempts. Not one of them could do it, not once. The best the official theory could muster was that it was theoretically possible. Theoretically. Despite the fact that nobody on Earth could actually reproduce it. That's not an explanation. That's a shrug dressed up in a lab coat. But let's be generous. Let's pretend, for 1 second, that Gareth was some impossible contortionist who managed the trick and then died inside. You still have a problem that no amount of imagination solves. Who cleaned the scene? There were no fingerprints on the padlock, none on the bag's exterior, none on the rim of the bath. Think about that. To get into the bag, Gareth would have had to handle the padlock, the zips, grip the edge of the tub. His prints should have been all over those surfaces. Instead, nothing. The exterior of the bag and the surrounding bathroom were wiped clean. A dead man, sealed inside a locked bag, cannot reach out and wipe down the outside of his own tomb. He cannot scrub the padlock he's no longer touching. He cannot polish the bathtub he's lying inside. The absence of his own prints on the things he supposedly handled isn't a quirk. It's proof that somebody else was in that room, somebody careful, professional, and equipped to erase themselves completely. And then there's the heating. Remember, this was a heat wave, and the central heating was deliberately turned up to maximum. Why would anyone do that? Well, here's a grim fact. Heat accelerates decomposition. Cranking the temperature in a sealed flat with a body in it speeds up the breakdown of tissue. And that does something very specific. It destroys the timeline. It makes it almost impossible to pin down the exact time of death. And critically, it degrades the body's chemistry, wiping out the trace markers that would let a pathologist detect poison, sedatives, or paralytic agents. In other words, The one environmental choice in that flat that made no sense for comfort made perfect sense for a cover-up. It's a known counter-forensic technique. It's what you do when you want the body to tell as few stories as possible. Now, stack it all up. A man missing for over a week with no alarm raised. A flat with no break-in and no struggle. A body locked in a bag from the outside, the key impossibly inside. A scene scrubbed of all fingerprints and DNA. The heat turned up to destroy the evidence. Every single one of those facts points away from lonely accident and toward something cold and deliberate and professional. Which brings us back to that week of silence. Why did MI6 wait so long? The official line is bureaucratic incompetence, a communication breakdown, paperwork, nobody connecting the dots, maybe. But here's the uncomfortable alternative. That delay gave someone time. Time to enter the flat, time to assess what Gareth knew, time to figure out whether their secrets had been compromised, and time to make the scene as clean as it was found. A week is a long time when you have a body to stage and a flat to sanitize. And then there's the part of the story that, honestly, makes me angriest. After Gareth's death, the press suddenly filled up with leaks about his private life. Stories that he had thousands of pounds of women's clothing in the flat, dozens of pairs of women's shoes, wigs, makeup, that he'd visited fetish and bondage websites, that years earlier, a landlady had once had to cut him free after he got stuck during some kind of escapology stunt. And the implication was obvious and cruel. This was a weird, secretive man who died doing something kinky and embarrassing. But here's the thing. Intelligence analysts pointed something out that the headlines conveniently skipped. Wigs, makeup, alternate clothing, those are standard tools of operational disguise. They're the kit of someone trained to change their appearance. And the timing of those leaks was awfully convenient. Just as the world started asking how a top codebreaker ended up dead in a padlocked bag in an MI6 safe house, the story quietly shifted to his underwear drawer. That's not investigation, that's character assassination. It's a way of getting the public to look at the victim instead of at the agency. So where does the case actually land? In 2012, the coroner who examined everything came to a firm conclusion. Gareth's death was unnatural, and in all probability, another person had been involved, a third party. Someone else was in that flat. That was the official coronial finding. And then, and this is the maddening part, the police later doubled back. A year on, the Metropolitan Police announced they now believed Gareth had probably been alone after all, that it was most likely a tragic accident, no third party, nothing sinister. They effectively closed the book on the very scene their own coroner had called criminally suspicious. He was buried on the island of Anglesey, back home in Wales, and at his funeral sat the head of MI6 himself, a quiet acknowledgement of just how valuable this young man had been to the British state. Gareth Williams spent his short life doing one thing better than almost anyone alive, taking impossible tangled codes and pulling them apart until they made sense. He found the pattern in the noise. He saw the answer where everyone else saw chaos. And then he died inside a locked bag, in a sealed room, in a secret flat, and left behind a puzzle so clean, so airtight, so professionally constructed that no one has ever been able to solve it. Or maybe that no one has ever been allowed to. It's a little after 4 a.m. on December 4th, 2003. Pitch black, freezing, the kind of cold that bites through your coat in rural Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, Amish country, where the roads turn to gravel and the nearest streetlight might be miles away. And behind a well drilling company on a road called Dry Tavern Road, there's a silver Honda Accord. Engine still running, headlights still burning a path into the dark. The car is nose down toward a shallow, icy little creek called Sinking Spring. And in that creek, face down in maybe a few inches of freezing water, is the body of a federal prosecutor. He's been suffered 36 puncture wounds. Now hold on, because here's the part that'll make your stomach drop. Within days, the people who were supposed to find out who killed him started whispering to reporters that nobody killed him at all, that he did this to himself. Let's slow down and walk through this one, because it is one of the strangest deaths in modern American legal history. His name was Jonathan Luna, 38 years old. And his story is, on paper, the American dream. He grew up in the Patterson houses, the projects in the South Bronx. Tough place, tough start. But Jonathan was sharp, driven, the kind of guy who claws his way up. He put himself through Fordham, then law school at the University of North Carolina. He worked at a white shoe firm, did a stint at the Federal Trade Commission, prosecuted cases in Brooklyn. And by 2003, he was an assistant United States attorney in Baltimore, a federal prosecutor, a rising star. And here's the thing about the work he was doing. Jonathan wasn't pushing paper. He was going after violent narcotics rings, the serious, dangerous end of the business. At the time he died, he was right in the middle of a high-stakes federal drug case, finalizing a plea agreement for 2 defendants. This is the kind of case where you're dealing with informants, with cooperating witnesses, with people whose freedom and whose lives hang on what gets written into a document, people who have very strong feelings about prosecutors. So picture the setting. December 3rd, 2003. Late evening. Jonathan is at the federal courthouse in downtown Baltimore. A secure building, bright lights, cameras, the safest place a man like him could possibly be. Around 9 o'clock that night, he's on the phone with a defense attorney. He says he's finishing the text of that plea agreement, and he promises to fax it over by midnight. That fax never came. Now, this is where it gets strange. At 11:38 p.m., Jonathan's silver Honda Accord pulls out of the courthouse complex and gets onto Interstate 95, heading northeast, which is a problem, because that's the exact opposite direction of his home and his family. He's not going home. He's going somewhere else in the middle of the night, and he didn't tell anyone. But here's the detail that really stops you. When investigators went through his office afterward, they found his glasses sitting on his desk, his cell phone on the desk, his wallet on the desk, his computer still on. Let's just sit with the glasses for a second. Jonathan needed those glasses to see, especially to drive at night, so we're being asked to believe that a man left his glasses, his phone, and his wallet behind, and then voluntarily drove off into the freezing dark for over 90 miles across 3 states on highways at night. Without the glasses he needed to drive, without the phone he'd need if anything went wrong, without the wallet that has his ID and his cards in it. Does that sound like a man making a plan? Or does that sound like a man who left in a hurry because he didn't have a choice? Let's follow the car because the route is genuinely bizarre. The Honda heads north. At 12:57 a.m., there's a $200 cash withdrawal from an ATM at a service plaza in Newark, Delaware. Then, at 2:47 in the morning, the car crosses the Delaware River and gets onto the Pennsylvania Turnpike. At 3:20 a.m., his debit card buys gas at a Sunoco near King of Prussia, outside Philadelphia. And then we get to the toll booth, and this is the moment everything tilts. For most of the trip, the car had been using an electronic EZ Pass to glide through tolls. But at 4:04 a.m., when the Honda exits the turnpike at the Reading-Lancaster interchange, somebody rolled down the window and pulled a paper toll ticket by hand. Why does that matter? Because when forensic teams later examined that toll ticket, they found a spot of blood on it. Jonathan Luna's blood. Think hard about what that tells us. The violence didn't start at the creek. It was already happening inside that car at 4:04 in the morning while it was still moving through the toll system. He was already bleeding behind the wheel, or somebody in that car was already bleeding, long before they ever reached Dry Tavern Road. And then, early that morning, employees at the Sensenig and Weaver Well Drilling Company show up for work and find the Accord idling behind the building, headlights on, pointed down toward the water. And in the creek, they find Jonathan, face down, dead. The scene is brutal. He suffered dozens of inexplicable puncture wounds, inflicted with his own small penknife. The trauma was overwhelmingly clustered around his neck. There's blood inside the car, smeared around, including in the back. His watch is still on his wrist, showing the right time. His gold wedding band, his college class ring, still on him. $10 still in his front pocket, 2 singles and a few more. The official cause of death. And when it finally comes back, not the stabbing. Drowning. Freshwater drowning in a couple of inches of creek. And almost immediately, Before the body's even cold practically, anonymous sources from the federal side start feeding reporters a story. The story is that Jonathan was under pressure, stressed about work, maybe scrutiny over money, and that he did this to himself, or a staged attack on himself that somehow went wrong. Okay, stop. Let's actually look at that, because it falls apart the second you apply any logic to it at all. Let's start with the wounds, 36 stab wounds. And here's the thing, they weren't all somewhere you could reach easily. There were wounds on his neck and wounds on his body, and the violence was frenzied and scattered. So I want you to actually try to picture the self-inflicted version. A man supposedly sustains 36 puncture wounds to highly sensitive areas, and at no point does the pain, the shock, or the sheer blood loss stop him. He just keeps going, 36 times, and then, after all that, he climbs out of the car, walks down to a creek, and lies face down in a few inches of freezing water until he drowns. That's not how the human body works. When you cause yourself that much trauma, you go into shock, you pass out. You don't calmly finish the job by drowning yourself in a puddle. Stab wounds in places that are awkward to reach, in a pattern investigators described as scattered and chaotic, scream one thing: somebody else was holding that knife. And here's the kicker, the local authorities knew it. The Lancaster County coroner, Dr. Gary Kirchner, and the Pennsylvania State Police looked at this scene and officially ruled it a homicide, a murder, flat out. These are the people who actually stood over the body. They didn't hedge. They said, someone did this to him. So you've got a genuine turf war. On one side, the local coroner and state police saying murder. On the other side, federal sources quietly leaking self-inflicted to friendly reporters. Same body, same evidence. Two completely opposite stories. And only one of those sides actually examined the scene. Now, the self-inflicted camp had a theory for the glasses and the strange drive, that he was spiraling, not thinking clearly. But that doesn't hold either. A man in a planned suicidal spiral doesn't stop to buy gas at 3:20 in the morning. He doesn't pull cash from an ATM. He doesn't keep his car fueled and pointed forward for a 90-mile haul. Those are the actions of someone trying to get somewhere, or someone being made to drive somewhere. And the personal life stuff that got leaked, the financial questions, the secret credit card, the activity on adult websites under his name. The feds floated all of that as motive. But notice what that really is. That's not evidence of how he died. That's character assassination. It's reaching into a dead man's private life to make a brutal homicide feel like the sad, embarrassing end of a stressed-out guy. And conveniently, it points the public away from the much scarier possibility that a federal prosecutor working a dangerous drug case was tortured and killed, and the agencies around him would rather you looked at his browsing history than at his caseload. There were other details that never fit as self-inflicted. The localized trauma. He'd been attacked in a highly personal, punishing manner as something personal and cruel. The bruise on his eye, the soil on his face, a single glove, a leaf tucked inside his coat. None of that is the tidy aftermath of a man alone with a penknife. That's the aftermath of a struggle, of being handled, of being dragged, and for years the full record stayed locked away. It wasn't until a long legal fight, pushed by Lancaster journalists and the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, that the autopsy was finally unsealed, 20-plus years later. And what it confirmed was exactly what the coroner said at the very beginning. The wounds, the drowning, the picture of a man who did not, could not, have done this to himself. So here's where we land. Jonathan Luna walked out of one of the most secure buildings in Baltimore late on a December night. He left behind his glasses, his phone, his wallet, everything a person takes when they're going somewhere on purpose. He drove 90 miles into the freezing dark, bleeding by the time he reached the last toll booth, and he ended up face down in a creek behind a well drilling company in Amish country, stabbed 36 times with his own little knife. The local experts called it murder from day one. The federal whisper machine called it self-inflicted and started sealing the file. 2 decades later, we still don't know who was in that car with him. We don't know why the drive ended where it did. We don't know what was so important about that plea agreement he never got to finish. A prosecutor who spent his life chasing dangerous people drove straight into the dark, and the very system he served seems perfectly content to let it stay there. It's just after dawn on June 18th, 1982. A postal worker is walking across Blackfriars Bridge in London, the Thames sliding by gray and cold underneath him. He glances down at the rusty metal scaffolding bolted beneath the bridge, the kind of grim industrial cage that hangs over the water during repairs. And there, swinging gently against the stone in the morning mist, is the body of a man, suspended beneath the bridge, an expensive suit, pockets stuffed with bricks and fistfuls of foreign cash. This isn't a quiet, hidden death. This is a body put on display in the heart of the world's financial capital, like a billboard, like a message. And the man hanging there was one of the most powerful, most dangerous financiers in all of Europe. Let's talk about Roberto Calvi, 62 years old, chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, Italy's second largest private bank. But that title doesn't capture it. The press had a nickname for him, and it's the one that stuck: God's banker. Why? Because Roberto Calvi was the financial right hand of the Vatican. He ran money for the Vatican Bank, the Institute for the Works of Religion, and he used his banking genius to build something staggering: a sprawling global money laundering machine, hidden inside one of the most respected financial institutions on the planet. But here's the thing about the company Calvi kept. His genius came with very, very bad friends. He wasn't just laundering for the church. He was deep in bed with the Sicilian mafia, Cosa Nostra, washing the profits from their heroin trade. And he was a card-carrying member of something called P2, Propaganda Due, a secret illegal Masonic lodge that operated like a shadow government inside Italy, packed with intelligence chiefs, military generals, and top politicians, all run by a fascist puppet master named Licio Gelli. So picture the web, the Vatican on one side, the mafia on another, a secret society of generals and spies pulling strings in the middle, and Roberto Calvi sitting right at the center of all of it, moving the money that held the whole thing together. Now, this is where it gets dangerous. Because by the summer of 1982, Calvi's bank was collapsing. There was a hole in the accounts, a black hole, investigators called it, somewhere around $800 million. By some counts, well over $1 billion. And a lot of that vanished money didn't belong to Calvi. It belonged to the mafia and to the P2 Lodge. Stop and think about what that means. Roberto Calvi had lost the mafia's money, hundreds of millions of it. And in that world, you do not lose the mafia's money and walk away to a quiet retirement. But it was worse than that. Because Calvi knew everything. He had the receipts. The paper trail that tied the Vatican Bank, Cosa Nostra, and the P2 Lodge into one giant criminal architecture. And with Italian magistrates closing in and prison looming, Calvi started doing the most dangerous thing a man in his position could possibly do. He started threatening to talk. On June 5th, he wrote a letter directly to Pope John Paul II, practically begging for the Vatican to step in and bail him out, warning of a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions in which the church itself would suffer. That's not a polite request. That's a man holding a grenade and showing everyone the pin. So now Calvi is the most dangerous kind of person alive, a frightened insider who is ready to name names. And on June 9th, he runs. He abandons his apartment in Rome. He shaves off his trademark mustache to change his appearance. He gets hold of a fake passport under the name Gian Roberto Calvini, and he flees to Venice. Then, a private jet to London by way of Zurich. He goes to ground in the city, hiding out, terrified. For about a week, he's a ghost in London. Then comes June 17th, the day before the body is found, and two things happen almost at once. In Milan, the Bank of Italy officially strips Calvi of his position. And on that very same day, his personal secretary, a woman named Graziella Corriere, falls to her death from a fifth-floor window at the bank's headquarters. She leaves behind a final note cursing Calvi for ruining the bank. Two people at the dead center of this collapsing empire, dead within 24 hours of each other, one in Milan, one in London. We'll come back to that, because the timing there is not a coincidence. And then, the next morning, the postman looks down off Blackfriars Bridge. The scene, as I said, was bizarre. Calvi hanging from the scaffolding, his expensive suit pockets crammed with about 7,500 pounds in different currencies, lira, pounds, Swiss francs, and stuffed with heavy masonry bricks. And despite all of this, the British authorities held a quick inquest and reached a verdict with startling speed: self-inflicted death. A disgraced banker, they said, who couldn't bear the shame of his ruined empire and ended it all. Okay, let's stop right there, because this might be the single least convincing self-inflicted death in modern history. Let's start with the pure physical logistics of it. Roberto Calvi was 62 years old. He was overweight. And, this is important, he reportedly suffered from vertigo. So the official theory asks us to believe the following: that in the dead of night, this heavy-set, vertigo-prone 62-year-old man on his own made his way down to the river, climbed over the bridge's parapet, and then clambered down a length of slippery, rusty scaffolding suspended over a fast-moving tidal river, in the dark, with his pockets weighed down by heavy bricks and a small fortune in cash. Try to picture that. Just the climb alone. A man afraid of heights, out of shape, in leather dress shoes, scaling down rickety metalwork over churning water at high tide. People who are terrified of heights don't choose to spend their final minutes dangling off scaffolding above a river. And even if he wanted to, physically, this is a young, fit person's stunt, not something a frightened older man pulls off solo in the dark. But here's the detail that absolutely shatters the self-inflicted theory: the hands and the shoes. Years later, in 1991, a serious forensic reinvestigation got underway, including work by the renowned forensic scientist Angela Gallup. And she examined something brilliantly simple. If Calvi had climbed down that rusted paint flake scaffolding himself, gripping the metal, bracing against it, then there would have to be traces of rust and paint on him, on his hands, under his fingernails, on the soles of his expensive leather shoes. There was nothing. Zero rust. Zero paint. His hands were clean. His shoes were clean. And that is a forensic impossibility. You cannot climb down a structure you never touched. The complete absence of those traces tells us flatly that Roberto Calvi did not climb that scaffolding at all, which means he was put there, lowered down from the bridge above, or floated underneath on a small boat at high tide and strung up by other hands. And then there are the bricks. The official idea was that Calvi loaded his own pockets with bricks to weigh himself down. But microscopic analysis found something chilling. Calvi's hands had never touched those bricks. He didn't pick them up. He didn't pack them into his own clothing. Someone else placed them on his body, which raises an obvious question. Why would a suicidal man's hands never have touched the very weights he supposedly used to kill himself? And then there's the body itself. Decades later, in 2002, Calvi was exhumed for a fresh autopsy, and the examination of his neck told its own story. The trauma to his neck was completely inconsistent with a simple fall. The injuries suggested he'd likely been strangled or subdued before he was ever hung from that bridge. In other words, he may already have been dead or close to it when he was found suspended beneath the bridge. So let's put the pieces together. And this is where it stops looking like a death and starts looking like a performance. Why Blackfriars Bridge, of all the bridges in London? Here's the part that gives me chills. Inside the P2 Masonic Lodge, the members had a nickname for themselves. They called each other Frati Neri. Translated from Italian, that means Black Friars. Calvi was hung beneath Blackfriars Bridge, the bricks in his pockets, masonry, the central symbol of the Masons, and the rope he was suspended with was tied in a particular knot associated with Masonic ritual. Now ask yourself, is that a coincidence? A disgraced, suicidal banker just happening to end his life beneath the one bridge in London, whose name is the literal nickname of his secret society, with stonemason's bricks in his pockets and a ritual knot around his neck? Or is that a message? A theatrical, deliberate, public execution, staged to be found and photographed and understood by exactly the right people. A warning, written in symbols, that says, "This is what happens to a black friar who breaks his silence." When you frame it that way, the self-inflicted death verdict isn't just wrong, it's almost insulting. And the secretary's death the day before? Suddenly, it doesn't look like a sad coincidence either. It looks like a purge, a coordinated effort to clean out the people at the center of the bank who knew where the money went and who it belonged to. So what actually happened to the official story? It took decades. The Calvi family fought relentlessly. The original 1982 self-inflicted verdict was eventually overturned for an open verdict in 1983, and finally, the authorities officially reclassified Roberto Calvi's death as murder. Not self-inflicted death, murder. And the prevailing theory today, the one that's now broadly accepted, is that Calvi was assassinated by the Sicilian Mafia, working hand in hand with the leadership of the P2 Lodge to enforce silence, to punish him for losing their fortune, and to make absolutely sure he could never hand those receipts to a prosecutor. But here's the gut punch ending. In 2005, 5 people, including the P2 Grandmaster Lizio Gelli and a senior mafia figure, were finally put on trial for the murder. And in 2007, they were all acquitted. Why? Because after 25 years, the evidence had degraded too far to convict anyone. The men who may have ordered the death of God's banker walked free, untouched by the law. Roberto Calvi held the keys to some of the darkest financial secrets of the entire 20th century, the place where the church, the mafia, and a secret government all came together over money. He could have blown the whole thing wide open. Instead, on a gray London morning, he was found swinging beneath a bridge whose name spelled out exactly who had silenced him. And the secrets he carried went down into the dark water of the Thames with him, where, more than 40 years later, they remain. It's 4:25 in the morning on June 18, 2013, on Highland Avenue in Los Angeles. A quiet, tree-lined stretch through the wealthy Hancock Park neighborhood. The street is empty, the city is asleep, and then a brand new Mercedes comes screaming down the road at full speed, jumps the median, and slams into a palm tree. But it doesn't just crash, it detonates. A fireball lights up the palm trees like daylight. The heat is so intense that witnesses describe a smell like burning metal and something chemical, almost like thermite. And when it's over, the car's heavy engine block has been torn clean out of the vehicle and hurled more than 100 feet down the street. This wasn't a fender bender. This looked like an explosion. And the man inside was one of the most fearless investigative journalists in America, a man who just hours earlier had told his friends he thought he was being hunted. Let's talk about Michael Hastings, 33 years old, an award-winning war correspondent and investigative reporter who wrote for Rolling Stone and BuzzFeed. And Michael was not your typical embedded journalist who cozies up to generals for access. He had open contempt for that game. He was fearless, abrasive, and absolutely allergic to power. He got close to the people he covered, and then he told the truth about them, no matter the cost, and he had the scalps to prove it. In 2010, Hastings wrote a profile for Rolling Stone called The Runaway General. It captured General Stanley McChrystal, the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan, and his staff mocking the civilian leadership, including the vice president. That single article ended McChrystal's career. The most powerful general in the war was forced to resign because of a story Michael Hastings wrote. So understand who we're dealing with. This is not a paranoid rookie. This is a man with the proven ability to take down 4-star generals with a notepad. He had highly placed sources, he had credibility, and by 2013, he had turned his attention to a far more dangerous target than the military. He'd started digging into the surveillance state. Remember the timing here. This is June 2013. The exact moment Edward Snowden's revelations were exploding across the world, exposing the sheer scale of NSA spying on ordinary Americans. The intelligence community was rattled and on the offensive, and the Obama administration was waging an aggressive campaign against leakers and the journalists who worked with them. And right in the middle of all that, Michael Hastings was working on what he reportedly believed was the biggest story of his life, a major investigation touching the CIA, government surveillance, and reportedly the agency's director, John Brennan himself. His last published piece, just days before he died, had a title that tells you exactly where his head was: Why Democrats Love to Spy on Americans. So now let's get to the final hours, because they are genuinely chilling. On June 17th, Hastings was clearly alarmed. He reached out to a lawyer associated with WikiLeaks, Jennifer Robinson, and warned her that he believed the FBI was investigating him, and that his situation might have, in his words, serious non-public complications. That's careful lawyerly language for something dangerous is happening, and I can't say it openly. Then, that same day, he fired off a panicked email to his colleagues and friends. In it, he said the feds were actively interviewing his close associates. He said he was onto a big story, and he said he needed to go off the radar for a bit. This is a man telling the people around him, "I'm being watched, I'm being hunted, I need to disappear for my own safety." But here's the detail that, for me, is the most haunting of all. In the hours before the crash, Hastings went to a neighbor, a woman named Jordana Thigpen, and he asked to borrow her car, her Volvo. Why? Because he was terrified to drive his own Mercedes. He told her he believed his car had been tampered with. He thought someone had done something to it. She said no. And a few hours later, in that very same Mercedes he was afraid to drive, Michael Hastings was dead. Let that sink in. The man explicitly said he thought his car was sabotaged. Then his car killed him in a way that looks like sabotage. And the official response? The LAPD looked at the wreckage and almost immediately ruled out foul play. A tragic accident. A single car, high-speed crash, reckless driving, maybe drugs in his system. Case closed. Okay, let's stop right there, because that explanation has some very serious problems. Let's start with the explosion itself, the physics of it. Michael Hastings was driving a brand new Mercedes C250, a modern luxury car. And modern cars are not Hollywood prop vehicles. They are meticulously engineered to do the opposite of explode. The whole design philosophy is to crumple, to absorb energy, to protect the people inside. They have crumple zones, reinforced cabins, fuel systems designed specifically to resist rupturing and igniting in a collision. Cars in real life very rarely burst into giant fireballs the way they do in action movies. And yet this one detonated with enough force to make seasoned investigators stop and stare. So ask yourself the obvious question: why did a vehicle built to crumple instead blow up like an incendiary device? And then there's the engine block. This is the part that really doesn't add up. In a high-speed front-end collision, a modern car's engine is actually designed to drop downward and slide under the passenger compartment, so it doesn't get pushed back and crush the people inside. It is engineered to go down. It is not engineered to launch. But in Hastings' crash, the engine block was sheared completely off the car and found more than 100 feet away, down the road. 100 feet. Think about the forces required to rip a heavy engine out of a vehicle and throw it the length of a basketball court. That is not what a frontal impact with a tree does. That is the signature of an explosion originating from inside or underneath the car, a force pushing outward, not a car simply hitting something and stopping. And it gets worse. Look at the moments before the crash. Video footage and eyewitness accounts described sparks and flames coming from underneath the car before it ever hit the tree, before the impact. Now think about that. A normal car doesn't catch fire and then crash. If there's already fire and sparks under the vehicle while it's still moving, that points to something happening to the car's systems, electrical, fuel, mechanical, before the collision, not because of it. And there were no skid marks, none. On an empty straight road, a man driving at high speed, if he lost control or panicked or tried to stop, you'd expect to see evidence of braking. Tire marks, some attempt to slow down. There was nothing, which means either no one tried to brake or the brakes weren't working. So now put those pieces together. A car that exploded when it shouldn't, an engine thrown 100 feet, fire visible before the crash, no braking at all, and a driver who had said hours earlier that his car was tampered with. And you start to understand why a lot of very serious people refuse to call this a simple accident. And here is where it gets genuinely unsettling. Richard Clarke, and this is not a fringe figure, this is the former U.S. National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism who served under 3 presidents, looked at this crash publicly and said it was consistent with a car cyber attack. His point was simple and terrifying. By 2013, the technology already existed to remotely hack into a modern car's onboard computer, to seize control of the steering, to slam the accelerator down, to disable the brakes, to essentially turn someone's own vehicle into a remote-controlled murder weapon and leave behind a scene that looks exactly like a tragic accident. At the time, that sounded like science fiction, but security researchers had already demonstrated it in controlled tests, taking over a car's critical systems through its computer. And then, in 2017, the so-called Vault 7 leaks revealed that the CIA had explored exactly this kind of capability, examining how to compromise the control systems of vehicles. The leaked material noted the agency had looked at vehicle systems, and observers pointed out the obvious dark implication that this would be a near-perfect method for an undetectable assassination. So the question that hangs over this entire case is brutal in its simplicity. The technology to do this existed. An agency with motive had looked into it, and the victim was a journalist actively investigating that agency, who explicitly said he thought his car had been messed with. Is that all a coincidence? Because that's the third great logic gap. A seasoned, paranoid journalist tells WikiLeaks lawyers and his own friends in writing that the FBI is hunting him and he needs to vanish. And then, just hours later, he supposedly happens to accidentally drive his own car at top speed into a tree and vaporize himself on an empty street. The official story asks us to file two extraordinary things: the explicit warning and the explosive death, under unrelated coincidence. That's a lot to swallow. And there's one more thing that bothered a lot of people. After the crash, the FBI did something it almost never does. It issued an unprompted public statement specifically denying that Michael Hastings had been under investigation. Now, the FBI's standard practice is to never confirm or deny active investigations. They live by no comment, so for them to volunteer a denial about a man whose own emails said the feds were closing in on him struck many as a strange, defensive move. Why deny something nobody had officially accused you of yet? The official record still says it was an accident, high speed, reckless driving, with the coroner noting trace amounts of drugs in his system. But the people who knew Michael pushed back hard on that too. Friends said Hastings was a notoriously cautious driver, that he drove like a grandma. Not the profile of a man who'd floor a brand new car to its limit down a residential street at 4 a.m. for no reason. Michael Hastings' death sent a cold shockwave through the world of journalism, because if it was what so many suspect it was, then the message was unmistakable. Dig too deep into the wrong agency, and your own car might become the thing that kills you. For investigative reporters covering national security, that's a terrifying thought to carry to work every day. Michael Hastings spent his career walking into actual war zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, chasing the truth through some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and he came home alive every time. In the end, the most dangerous battlefield he ever stepped onto wasn't overseas at all. It was a quiet, empty street in Los Angeles at 4:25 in the morning in a car he was already afraid to drive. Picture a budget hotel bathroom in the middle of nowhere. Harsh fluorescent light, a standard tub, the kind you'd find in 10,000 roadside Sheratons. Except the scene they found inside was incredibly grim. And next to it, arranged almost neatly on the tile, sits an empty beer can, a half-finished bottle of red wine, and a broken glass. Like someone set the stage for a sad, quiet ending. It's August 10th, 1991. Martinsburg, West Virginia, and the man in that tub came to this town because he said he'd finally cracked the biggest story of his life. Let's talk about Danny Casolaro. Now, before we go anywhere, I need you to throw out the image you've got in your head of the paranoid loner journalist scribbling on walls, because that's not who this guy was. Joseph Daniel Casolaro, Danny to everyone who knew him, was 44 years old. He owned a computer trade magazine. He was a freelance investigative journalist, charming, social, and by all accounts completely in control of his life. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He had a paper trail, a massive one. And here's the thing about that paper trail. Danny had stumbled onto something he started calling the octopus. Picture a single creature sitting in the dark with tentacles reaching into every dirty corner of the late 20th century. At the center of it was a piece of software called Promise. On paper, boring stuff. A case management program built by a private firm called Inslaw. But Danny's theory was that the U.S. Department of Justice had essentially stolen it, slipped secret backdoors into the code, and then quietly sold it to intelligence agencies and banks all over the world. A spy tool hiding inside ordinary software, watching everyone's data from the inside. And once he pulled that one thread, the whole sweater started coming apart. The collapse of the BCCI Bank, the savings and loan crisis, Iran-Contra, the private security giant Wackenhut, the October surprise. Danny believed all of these weren't separate scandals at all. They were tentacles, same beast, and he was telling people he finally had the documents to prove it. So in early August of 1991, he tells his friends something electric. He says he's got it. He knows everything now, and he's driving out to West Virginia to meet one last source, a guy who's going to hand him the final smoking gun piece of evidence. Now, this is where the story starts to feel less like journalism and more like a thriller. Because before Danny left, he didn't pack like a man on a routine trip. He went to his brother, and he said something that should make the hair on your neck stand up. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "If anything happens to me, if there's an accident and I die, don't believe it." Sit with that for a second. That's not the kind of thing you say before a quiet weekend drive. That's the kind of thing you say when you already feel the breath on the back of your neck. He drives out to Martinsburg. He checks into the Sheraton. And on the afternoon of August 9th, witnesses see him meet with an unidentified man and watch that man hand Danny a thick stack of documents. The exact thing he came for. That evening, around 9, he's hanging around the hotel with a local named William Looney. At one point, Danny excuses himself to make a phone call. He's waiting on his big source, the main event. He comes back a few minutes later, a little deflated, and says the guy might have blown him off. But, and this matters, he stays. He doesn't pack up and leave town disappointed. He stays put. Around 10 that night, he walks over to a nearby convenience store and buys a cup of coffee. Routine. Forgettable. And that cup of coffee is the last time anyone sees Danny Casolaro alive. Then, silence. The next morning, 2 hotel maids let themselves into room 517, and they find the scene I described at the top. Danny, deceased in the tub, the wine, the beer, the broken glass arranged like props, and here's the first thing that should stop you cold. The local authorities looked at this, a journalist who'd been loudly telling everyone he was about to blow open a massive conspiracy, and they ruled it self-inflicted almost immediately. No real pause, no, let's wait and see. Just, he killed himself. Case closed. Okay, hold on a second, let's look at that again. Because the more you actually examine this scene, the less it behaves like a self-inflicted, and the more it behaves like a cover story someone wrote in a hurry. Let's start with the wounds. Danny didn't have one clean cut. He sustained over a dozen severe parallel injuries to his arms, trauma that physically incapacitated his hands. And I want you to actually try to picture the mechanics of that, because this is where the official story breaks. When you sustain damage that's severe to your arms, your hands physically stop functioning. That's what tendons do. They're the cables that let you grip and move. When you sustain damage that's severe to your arms, your hands physically stop functioning. How do you then switch the tool over and inflict a dozen more deliberate identical marks on the other side, with hands that are failing, slick with evidence, while you're losing consciousness from the blood loss? People don't tend to inflict that much careful, repetitive damage on themselves. The body fights you, the pain, the shock, the fainting. Your nervous system slams the brakes. 12 deep, deliberate incisions reads less like a man in despair and more like a man being worked over. And it wasn't just me noticing this. Elliot Richardson, and this is not some basement blogger, this is a former Attorney General of the United States who happened to be representing Inslaw, came out publicly and said the idea of Danny taking his own life that way, under those circumstances, was deeply implausible. When a former AG looks at your open and shut, self-inflicted death and says that doesn't add up, you should probably listen. But here's the thing. Even if you somehow accept the wounds, and you shouldn't, you still have to explain the file. Danny Casolaro went everywhere with his evidence. Friends described a bulging accordion file, a briefcase, the physical guts of the octopus, his manuscript, his research. The whole reason he existed, professionally, was inside that case. And remember, witnesses watched a source hand him a fresh stack of documents the day before he died. When investigators went through room 517, gone. The briefcase, gone. His tape deck, gone. The documents he'd just received, gone. The manuscript draft of the book he'd staked his life on, gone. So let me ask you the obvious question. If Danny planned to kill himself, why did the evidence vanish? Think about it. A man who has spent years of his life trying to drag this story into the light does not, in his final hour, decide to make all of it disappear. Taking your own life doesn't steal your briefcase. Despair doesn't tidy up the room and walk off with your manuscript. Somebody took those files. And the only reason you take the files is because the files were the entire point. And now it gets worse. Because of what happened to Danny's body. His family wasn't even told he was dead until 2 days after he was found. 2 days. And in those 2 days, his body was quietly released to a local funeral home and embalmed. Fast. Now, why does that matter? Because embalming flushes the entire body with chemicals. It chemically destroys the blood. And when you destroy the blood, you destroy any chance of a real toxicology report. You can no longer test for sedatives, for paralytics, for the kind of compliance drugs you'd use to subdue a man so he can't fight back while you stage a scene. So picture the timing. A journalist who publicly warned his own brother not to believe an accident turns up dead. And before his family even knows he's gone, before anyone can demand an independent look, his body is chemically scrubbed of evidence. That's not a clerical error. That's a window closing. And the room? Same story. Hotel management brought in an industrial cleaning crew and sanitized room 517 fast, before any serious independent forensic investigation could happen. Blood spatter patterns, fingerprints, trace DNA, the stuff that tells you whether one person was in that room or 3, scrubbed away. The crime scene was erased before it was ever really a crime scene. And then there's the detail I keep coming back to. The wine, the beer, the broken glass, all staged around the tub like the setting for a depressive, drunken final night. Except the toxicology, the limited, compromised toxicology they could still get, came back with 0 alcohol in Danny's system. None. So whose drinks were those? Somebody arranged that bottle and that can to tell a story. The story of a sad, lonely man drinking himself into a final decision. But the body says he never touched a drop. Which means the props don't match the corpse. And props that don't match the corpse means somebody else dressed the set. So step back and look at the whole thing at once. A man who predicted his own murder, a dozen impossible wounds, a vanished briefcase full of the exact evidence he came to deliver, a body embalmed before his family even knew, a room scrubbed clean at industrial speed, and a staged drinking scene contradicted by his own blood. Any one of those, on its own, you could maybe wave away. A coincidence. A small-town police force in over their heads. But all of them? Stacked on top of each other? That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. That's a cleanup. The official ruling never changed. In January of 1992, West Virginia authorities looked at all of it again and reaffirmed it. Self-inflicted death, locked room, razor blades, done. But the software was real. Inslaw really did fight the Justice Department for years over promise. The tentacles Danny was tracing, BCCI, Iran-Contra, the rest, those were real scandals with real bodies attached. The octopus was never fully pulled out of the water. It just slipped back under. Danny Casolaro drove to a quiet little town in West Virginia because he believed he was finally going to hand the truth to the world. He believed he had the proof in a battered accordion file. That file was never found. And whatever was inside it, whatever was worth a man's life, is still down there in the dark, still watching, still uncounted. He told his brother not to believe the accident. Maybe we shouldn't. It's around 2:30 in the morning on November 28, 1953, Thanksgiving weekend. Freezing cold outside, high up in the Hotel Statler in Midtown Manhattan, two men are asleep in twin beds in a dark hotel room, room 1018A. The shades are down, the heavy curtains are pulled shut, the room is sealed in near total blackness, and then, in an instant, one of those men goes through the window, shattering the glass and falling more than 100 feet to the sidewalk on 7th Avenue below, landing in nothing but his undershirt and shorts. For more than 20 years, the government's story was simple. A troubled man jumped. What they didn't tell anyone, for 2 decades, was that they had secretly fed him a massive dose of hallucinogen just days before. And once you pull on that thread, the whole tragic self-inflicted death story starts to unravel into something far darker. Let's talk about Frank Olson. Frank was a scientist, a brilliant one, a bacteriologist working out of Camp Detrick in Maryland, the beating heart of America's biological warfare program. He held a captain's rank in the Army Medical Corps, and he worked hand in glove with the CIA inside their Special Operations Division. This was the height of the Cold War, a time when the American government was gripped by a near-paranoid obsession with secret weapons, invisible diseases, mind control, brainwashing. And Frank Olson was on the inside of all of it. But here's the thing that makes Frank dangerous. He had a conscience, and it was eating him alive. Olson had seen things. According to those close to him, he had first-hand knowledge of some of the most monstrous operations of the early Cold War, the use of biological agents and the interrogations conducted on expendable human subjects in Europe, where prisoners and defectors were dosed with experimental drugs and worse. Frank knew the details. He'd been in the room, and it was destroying him. By the autumn of 1953, Frank Olson wanted out. He'd told his superiors he wanted to resign. He wanted to walk away from the whole terrible apparatus, and in the suffocating paranoid logic of 1950s intelligence that made him the most dangerous kind of person alive. A man with a guilty conscience and a head full of state secrets who wants to quit and talk. Overnight, Frank Olson stopped being a valued scientist and became a security risk. Now, this is where it gets sinister. In mid-November 1953, Olson and a group of colleagues went to a secluded retreat at Deep Creek Lake in rural Maryland. And during that retreat, after dinner, Frank was handed a glass of Cointreau, a sweet liqueur. What Frank didn't know, what nobody told him, was that his drink had been secretly spiked, laced with a heavy dose of hallucinogen. And the man who did it was Sidney Gottlieb, the notorious head of the CIA's MK Ultra mind control program. This wasn't a prank. It was an experiment. The CIA wanted to know, if you secretly dose a man who knows secrets, will the drug make him spill them? They used their own scientist as an unwitting guinea pig. And Frank did not react well. Over the following days, he spiraled, sliding into deep, relentless paranoia. He was distressed, agitated, unraveling. The CIA, watching their experiment go sideways with a man who already wanted to quit, decided he needed help. So they assigned him a minder, a CIA operative named Robert Lashbrook, and sent him to New York City, supposedly to see a psychiatrist. Specifically, a doctor named Harold Abramson, who conveniently was an hallucinogen specialist working with the agency. So the man sent to help Frank recover from a secret CIA drugging was himself part of the CIA's drug program. On the evening of November 27th, Olson and Lashbrook had dinner downstairs at the hotel's Café Rouge, and then went up to their shared room. Lashbrook would later claim Frank was actually in good spirits that night. Cheerful, he said, and that the two of them simply went to sleep in their separate twin beds around 11 o'clock. And then, a few hours later, in the pitch dark, Frank Olson went through the window. The official story, once it finally came out in 1975, was this. The hallucinogen had triggered a delayed catastrophic bad trip, and in a state of drug-induced psychosis, Frank intentionally fell from the window. A tragic, self-inflicted death, an accident of chemistry. The government even paid the family a settlement, and President Gerald Ford personally apologized for the drugging. But here's the problem. Apologizing for the hallucinogen is not the same as explaining the fall. And the more you look at that fall, the less it looks like a man jumping. Let's start with the window itself, because this is the detail that should stop you cold. Remember the setup. The room is dark, the shades are down, the heavy curtains are drawn shut, there are 2 beds in the way. So the official story asks us to believe that Frank Olson woke up in a strange, pitch-black hotel room, got out of bed, sprinted across the room in the dark, somehow avoided crashing into the furniture, blew through the closed curtains and shades, and dove head first, body first, through a closed pane of thick hotel glass. Even the hotel's own night manager thought that was absurd. Think about the physics of it. To go through a closed window, in the dark, you'd have to know exactly where it was, build up speed, and hit it dead on. That's not the flailing, disoriented behavior of a man lost in a drug panic. That's a clean, committed, almost impossibly precise trajectory. But forget all that for a second, because here's the part that, for me, ends the debate entirely. Decades later, in 1994, Frank's son Eric did something extraordinary. He had his father's body exhumed and a second independent autopsy performed by a respected forensic pathologist, Dr. James Starrs of George Washington University. And what Starrs found rewrote the entire case. First, there were no glass cuts. None. No lacerations on Frank Olson's head, none on his neck. Now think about that. If you dive headfirst through a pane of thick glass, your face goes through first. You would suffer severe lacerations. It is physically unavoidable. And yet, Frank's head and neck were clean. How do you go through a closed window face first and not get a single cut from the glass? The simplest answer is the most chilling one, because he didn't go through the glass face first while he was conscious and alive. The glass was probably broken some other way. And second, and this is the smoking gun, Dr. Starrs found a massive blunt force head trauma, a large area of bleeding and bruising on the side of Frank's head, along with a serious blunt force injury to his chest. And critically, the analysis suggested these injuries had happened before the fall, before he hit the ground. Sit with what that means. A blow to the head, hard enough to cause a major hematoma, delivered before Frank Olson left that room. That is not consistent with a man jumping out a window. That's consistent with a man being struck, knocked unconscious, and then thrown out of it. The glass shatters, the body falls, and the scene reads as a self-inflicted death. But the wound on his skull tells the truth. He was hit first. And then there's Robert Lashbrook, the CIA minder, the man who was in the room. Picture the scene from his side. His roommate has just gone out a 10th floor window in the middle of the night. A man Lashbrook was personally assigned to watch and protect. So what does a horrified, innocent person do in that moment? They scream. They run to the window. They call for an ambulance. They sprint downstairs. They panic. That is not what Lashbrook did. When the hotel staff rushed up, they didn't find a man in shock. They found Robert Lashbrook calmly sitting on the toilet and on the phone. And here's the truly haunting part. The hotel switchboard operator listened in on that call. And according to her, Lashbrook wasn't sobbing or shouting. He simply said 4 flat words. "Well, he's gone." And the voice on the other end, Dr. Abramson, the hallucinogen doctor, replied just as coldly, "Well, that's too bad." "Well, he's gone. That's too bad." Read that exchange again and ask yourself what it sounds like. Does that sound like 2 men reacting to a sudden, horrifying tragedy? Or does it sound like an operative reporting that a job has been completed and a handler quietly acknowledging it? There's no panic in it, no grief, no urgency, just confirmation. It reads less like the aftermath of a self-inflicted death and more like the closeout of an operation. So let's stack it all up. A scientist with a conscience who wanted to quit and talk, secretly dosed with hallucinogen by the head of the CIA's mind control program, sent to New York in the custody of an agency minder, dead within days, out a window, in the dark, in a sealed room. No glass cuts on a man who supposedly dove through glass, a blunt force head wound that came before the fall, and a roommate who responded to the death with the emotional temperature of a man filing paperwork. Any one of those, maybe you explain away. All of them together, that's not a bad trip, that's a pattern. Now, in fairness, the official position was never formally changed to murder. There was no trial, no conviction, no smoking gun document that says, "We killed Frank Olson." The government's line remains that this was a drug experiment that ended in tragedy. The 1975 admission, the apology from a sitting president, the settlement paid to the family, all of it was framed around the hallucinogen, not around a killing. But Frank Olson's family has never bought it. His son Eric spent his entire life fighting for the truth, and after that second autopsy, he became absolutely convinced of what happened, that his father hadn't acted alone, that Frank Olson was executed, murdered to make sure that everything he knew about America's biological weapons and the agency's darkest experiments died with him on that sidewalk. Frank Olson saw the very worst of what his country was doing in the shadows of the Cold War. And unlike the men around him, he couldn't live with it. He wanted to put it down. He wanted to walk away. But you don't walk away from secrets like that. And in the end, the only exit they left him was a closed window, 10 floors up, in the dark. It's the morning of September 18, 2006, in La Plata, Argentina, a busy, modern city, the capital of Buenos Aires province. Wide boulevards, traffic, people heading to work in the daylight, and somewhere on those ordinary streets, a 76-year-old man puts on his shoes, steps out of his front door, and simply ceases to exist. No struggle anyone saw, no blood, no dropped keys, no body, nothing. Thousands of police would eventually comb the country looking for him, and they would find absolutely nothing. He was just gone. And here's what makes this one of the most chilling cases you will ever hear. This was the second time this man had been made to disappear. Let's talk about Julio Jorge Lopez. On the surface, he was the most unremarkable man imaginable. 76 years old, a retired bricklayer, a construction worker, the kind of quiet working-class grandfather you'd walk past 100 times and never notice. But underneath that ordinary exterior was one of the bravest people in Argentina. Because to understand Julio Lopez, you have to understand what happened to Argentina in the 1970s. From 1976 to 1983, Argentina was ruled by a brutal military dictatorship. And during what became known as the Dirty War, the regime didn't just arrest its political enemies, it disappeared them. Tens of thousands of people, students, activists, union members, ordinary citizens, were snatched off the streets by security forces, taken to secret detention centers, tortured, and murdered. Their bodies were dumped in mass graves or thrown from planes into the sea. The word for these victims became seared into the national memory. Los desaparecidos. The disappeared. And Julio Lopez was one of them. In 1976, he was kidnapped by the state. He was held in clandestine torture centers for nearly 3 years. He endured things most of us can't bring ourselves to imagine. And this is the crucial part. He survived. He lived. He came out the other side carrying the names, the faces, and the exact details of what was done to him and to the people who didn't make it. For decades, those memories had nowhere to go. Amnesty laws protected the perpetrators. But in 2006, Argentina overturned those laws and began putting the architects of the Dirty War on trial. And Julio Lopez, this quiet old bricklayer with a photographic memory, became the single most important witness in one of the most important trials in the country's history. His target was a man named Miguel Echecolatz, the former director of investigations for the Buenos Aires Provincial Police, a man accused of overseeing torture and murder on a massive scale. And Lopez could place him there. He could describe the secret detention center known as the Pozo de Arana. He could name names. His testimony was so precise, so detailed, that it helped the justice system confirm where bodies were buried, leading investigators toward mass graves holding the remains of the regime's victims. This wasn't a minor witness. Julio Lopez was the crown jewel of the prosecution. He was the man who was going to help put a monster away for life. So picture the scene in that courtroom. An old man, frail, takes the stand, and he looks his torturer dead in the eye, the man who had once held absolute power over his life and death, and he tells the truth, out loud, in public, after 30 years. It takes a kind of courage most of us will never be asked to summon. His testimony was devastating. A conviction was all but guaranteed. And then, we get to September 18th, 2006. The day before the final arguments, the day before Echecolatz would be sentenced to life in prison, the finish line. The moment Julio Lopez had waited 3 decades for. He was supposed to go to the courthouse that morning. His nephew was scheduled to come pick him up and escort him to the heavily guarded court. But, and this is the first strange note, Lopez didn't wait for him. Uncharacteristically, the old man left his house in the Los Hornos neighborhood alone. He never made it to court. He never came back. He vanished. A massive search exploded across the country. Police, federal agents, public appeals. The provincial government eventually posted a reward of 200,000 pesos, around 64,000 US dollars, for any information. And it produced nothing. Not a single solid lead. No trace. He had become a desaparecido for the second time in his life. Now, this is where it gets strange, and where we have to apply some hard logic, because in the early days, there were people floating some very convenient theories. The first was that maybe Lopez, old, traumatized, reliving the worst experiences of his life on the witness stand, had simply cracked. That he'd suffered some kind of psychological break, gotten confused, wandered off, lost his memory. Or that he'd gotten scared and chosen to go into hiding. Let's actually think about that. This is a man who spent 30 years carrying the unbearable weight of what was done to him. 30 years. And he risked his life to come forward and testify, knowing exactly who he was up against. He had already delivered the testimony. The hard part was done. The conviction was coming. So why, at the precise moment of his ultimate victory, the day before he'd see his torturer sentenced to life, would he willingly walk away? Why would the man who waited 3 decades for justice skip the verdict? It makes no emotional sense. It makes no human sense. A man doesn't climb a mountain for 30 years and then turn around 2 steps from the summit, and the "he wandered off and got lost" idea falls apart even faster. Because consider the second logic gap, the sheer impossibility of how he vanished. At that moment, Julio Lopez was arguably the most famous and most watched witness in the entire country. His face was known, his trial was front-page news, and he disappeared from a busy city in broad daylight, on ordinary streets, with no witnesses to a struggle, no physical evidence, no crime scene, nothing. Think about what that actually requires. A confused old man who takes a wrong turn gets found. He turns up at a hospital, a bus station, a police precinct, on a security camera, in a field. His body surfaces. Something appears. But a high-profile public figure who evaporates completely, leaving zero trace, who is never found despite a nationwide manhunt and a $64,000 reward, that is not an accident. That doesn't happen because Grandpa got lost. That takes planning, surveillance, secure transport, safe houses, a team. It takes the ability to grab a person and erase them so cleanly that the entire machinery of a modern state can't find a single thread to pull. And who has that capability? Who has the experience, the resources, and the institutional cover to disappear a human being without a trace? The exact same kind of people Julio Lopez was testifying against. Because here's the detail that turns this from a tragedy into something genuinely sinister. When Lopez first vanished, guess who got handed the job of investigating his disappearance? The Buenos Aires Provincial Police, the very institution Lopez was testifying against. The same force that had been built around men like Echecolatz, still staffed in places by officers who'd served under him or stayed loyal to him. Let that sink in. The prime suspects were put in charge of the investigation. For something like 2 years, the people most likely to have made Lopez disappear were the ones supposedly searching for him. That's not an oversight. That's a fox being asked to investigate the missing chickens, and then being trusted to report back honestly. And then there's the message. Because that's really what this was. Look at the terrible poetry of it. The state kidnapped Julio Lopez in 1976, and he survived to tell the tale. 30 years later, on the eve of his testimony putting that system on trial, the state, or the shadows of it that never went away, took him again, permanently. And the timing wasn't subtle. It was a statement broadcast to every other survivor and every other potential witness in Argentina. You think the death squads are gone. You think democracy protects you. We are still here. We can still reach anyone, even now. That's the function of an enforced disappearance. It's not just about silencing one person, it's about terrifying everyone else into silence. And it worked on a national scale. The disappearance of Lopez sent a wave of fear through every human rights trial in the country. But if you think that's chilling, wait. Because years later, 8 years on, during another trial, Miguel Echecolatz was photographed leaving a courtroom, and in his hand was a piece of paper. And on that paper, written in his own handwriting, were 3 words. Secuestrar a Jorge Julio Lopez. Kidnap Jorge Julio Lopez. He wrote it down. He carried it into a courtroom. He let it be seen. It wasn't a confession in any legal sense, but it was a taunt, a flex, a man so confident in his own untouchability that he could practically wave the order in the face of the justice system, daring them to do anything about it. So, where does it all land? Echecolatz, the torturer, was convicted. He was sentenced to life, and the court took the extraordinary step of declaring his crimes part of a genocide. In that narrow sense, Lopez won. His testimony did exactly what he hoped it would do, but Julio Lopez himself was never found. Not a body, not a bone, not a trace. To this day, he remains officially disappeared, Argentina's most heartbreaking modern mystery and proof that the shadow network of the dirty war didn't die when the dictatorship ended. It just went quiet and waited. His disappearance did force one thing, though. The horror of it pushed Argentina to finally create its first real national witness protection program, built, in a sense, on the back of a man it failed to protect. Julio Jorge Lopez survived the unsurvivable once. He walked out of the regime's torture chambers alive, carrying the truth in his head, and he held onto it for 30 years until he could finally lay it down in a court of law. He told the world the truth, and the second time he exposed the darkness made sure he would never get the chance to do it again. He stepped out his front door on an ordinary morning in 2006 and walked straight back into 1976. It's a warm afternoon in July 2003 in the gentle rolling countryside of Oxfordshire, England. Picture it, green fields, hedgerows, a quiet little village called Southmoor, the kind of place where nothing happens. And about a mile from one of those village homes, there's a patch of woodland on a low rise called Harrowdown Hill, overgrown, tangled with brambles, secluded enough that ramblers rarely wander in. The next morning, in that quiet glade, searchers will find the body of one of the most important scientists in the Western world. And what's deeply, deeply strange, is how clean the scene is. No chaos, no disturbed earth, barely any blood. A man supposedly bled to death here, and the woods look like nothing happened at all. Let's talk about Dr. David Kelly, 59 years old, a soft-spoken Welsh scientist. And not just any scientist, David Kelly was arguably the foremost expert on biological weapons in the entire Western world. He'd run the microbiology division at Porton Down, Britain's top defense lab. He was a veteran United Nations weapons inspector who spent the 1990s crawling through Iraq, hunting for Saddam Hussein's hidden weapons programs. This was the man who personally helped uncover Iraq's covert anthrax production. When governments wanted to know the truth about weapons of mass destruction, David Kelly was the man they called, which is exactly what makes what happened to him so dangerous. Because in the spring of 2003, as the US and UK were marching toward the invasion of Iraq, the British government published an intelligence dossier. And that dossier contained a now infamous claim that Saddam Hussein could deploy weapons of mass destruction within 45 minutes. 45 minutes. It was terrifying. It made headlines, and it helped sell a war to a skeptical public. Now, here's the explosive part. David Kelly had a quiet, off-the-record conversation with a BBC journalist named Andrew Gilligan. And in that conversation, Kelly said something that struck right at the foundation of the entire war. He said the dossier had been, and this is the phrase that became legendary, sexed up. That the dramatic 45-minute claim had been inserted to make the threat sound scarier than the intelligence actually justified, allegedly at the urging of Downing Street's communications chief. Think about who's saying this, not some random critic. The single most credible weapons expert in the country telling a reporter that the government cooked the books to justify a war. If that got out and stuck, it could bring down a prime minister. David Kelly, just by knowing what he knew, had become one of the most inconvenient men alive. So what happened next? The government didn't protect him. They exposed him. When the BBC story blew up and everyone wanted to know the source, there was a hunt inside the Ministry of Defense, and on July 9th, David Kelly was effectively outed, his name pushed into the public, stripping away his anonymity. He went from being a trusted behind-the-scenes expert to a man at the center of a global political firestorm overnight. And then, they put him on trial by television. On July 15th, Kelly was hauled before a parliamentary committee and grilled aggressively on camera in front of the whole country. People who watched it described a man who looked cornered, humiliated, crushed under pressure he never asked for. 2 days later, July the 17th, 2003, David Kelly told his wife he was going out for his usual afternoon walk. He left their home in Southmore and headed toward the woods at Harrowdown Hill, about a mile away. He never came home. That evening, his family raised the alarm. A search began, and the next morning, July 18th, a volunteer search team found him in the woods, slumped against a tree. The official conclusion came fairly quickly: self-inflicted death. The story: David Kelly, overwhelmed by the public humiliation, ingested a quantity of painkillers and sustained a fatal localized injury with a pruning knife he'd apparently owned since he was a boy. Tragic, sad, case closed. Except, no, let's slow this right down, because almost every single element of that official story has a hole in it big enough to drive a truck through. Let's start with the blood, or rather, the lack of it. The official cause of death was that Kelly succumbed to blood loss from a highly specific, localized wound. Now, here's the thing you need to understand about the ulnar artery. It's the smaller of the two main arteries in the wrist, and it sits deep, tucked away. And when you sustain an injury to that specific area, the body has a defense mechanism. The vessel tends to retract and spasm, clamping itself down to slow the bleeding. Inflicting that kind of precise trauma to that specific vessel is, medically, very hard to do. And here's where it gets damning. The paramedics who reached the scene, and remember, these are professionals who deal with trauma for a living, said there was nowhere near enough blood at the scene for someone to have bled to death there. One of them, Vanessa Hunt, was openly baffled by it. The vegetation was undisturbed. There was no evidence of the extreme blood loss required for that cause of death. The amount of blood present was, in their judgment, simply not consistent with fatal blood loss. So sit with that contradiction for a second. The official cause of death is, he bled to death. The first responders are saying, but there wasn't enough blood for anyone to bleed to death. Those two statements cannot both be true. How do you die of blood loss without losing a fatal amount of blood? Okay, next. The pills. The story says Kelly overdosed on coproximol, but the toxicology raised eyebrows immediately. The level of the drug actually found in his system was low, by several accounts, far below what would normally be considered a lethal dose, roughly a third of it. So the pills probably didn't kill him either. You've now got a cause of death where neither the cut nor the overdose, on their own or together, comfortably accounts for a dead body. And then there's the detail that, for a lot of people, breaks the case wide open. The fingerprints. When forensic information was finally pried loose years later, in 2007, through Freedom of Information requests, it revealed something genuinely bizarre. There were no fingerprints on the pruning knife he supposedly used to cut himself, none on the blister packs of the pills he supposedly opened and swallowed, none on the water bottle, none on his mobile phone. And David Kelly was not wearing gloves. Now think about the basic mechanics here. To do what the official story says he did, Kelly had to grip a knife and cut himself. He had to pop pills out of blister packs. That's a fiddly two-handed job. He had to handle a water bottle to wash them down. Barehanded, every one of those actions leaves fingerprints. It's almost impossible not to. And yet, nothing. Clean. So either a dying man meticulously wiped down every single one of his own self-inflicted death implements before he expired in the woods, or somebody else handled them, wearing gloves, and wiped them clean afterward. A sanitized scene doesn't happen by accident, and the strangeness doesn't stop at the body. Look at the timeline around the search, because it's full of things that just don't line up. The police operation to find Kelly, codenamed Operation Mason, was officially logged as starting at 2:30 in the afternoon on July 17th. The problem? That's over a half an hour before the time Kelly was supposedly last seen alive, and well before his family had even reported him missing. How do you open a missing person operation for a man who, on paper, isn't missing yet and is still alive? Who told the police to start looking, and how did they know to look? Then there's the helicopter. On the night Kelly disappeared, a police search helicopter equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew directly over the Harrowdown Hill area. Thermal cameras detect heat. A recently deceased body still gives off heat for hours, and according to the timeline, Kelly's body should have been there, still warm, when that helicopter passed over. But the thermal camera picked up nothing, no heat signature at all. Which raises an unsettling question: was the body even there yet? There were even reports of unidentified men in dark clothing seen near the edge of those woods around the time of the discovery. And the testimony about the body itself was contradictory. One detective initially described Kelly lying flat on his back, then later changed it to match the searchers who said he was slumped against a tree. Small thing, maybe. But in a clean investigation, the body doesn't move between witness accounts. And now we get to the single biggest red flag of all: the cover. When a person dies suddenly and unexpectedly in England, the law is clear. You hold a coroner's inquest, a proper legal process, witnesses under oath, cross-examination. It's how a society makes sure a suspicious death gets examined honestly. That is not what happened with David Kelly. Instead, the government set up a special public inquiry, the Hutton Inquiry, which was deliberately structured to take the place of a coroner's inquest. And the crucial difference? At the Hutton Inquiry, witnesses were not required to give evidence under oath. The single most powerful tool for getting at the truth was quietly set aside. And then, when it was all over, Lord Hutton did something with no real precedent. He ordered that David Kelly's medical records, his autopsy report, and the photographs of his body be sealed. Not for a year, not for 10, for 70 years. Locked away until the 2070s, long after everyone involved is dead and gone. Just ask yourself the obvious question. If this was a straightforward, tragic, self-inflicted death of a man broken by stress, why hide the evidence for 70 years? You seal documents for 70 years when you don't want anyone alive today to ever check your work. So where does that leave us? The official position, to this day, is self-inflicted death. The Hutton Inquiry said so, and the government has stood by it. But an extraordinary number of people refuse to accept it. We're not talking about basement conspiracy theorists. We're talking about groups of doctors and surgeons who publicly challenged the medical findings, members of parliament who demanded a real inquest, intelligence veterans who looked at the whole picture and saw the unmistakable signature of a man who was silenced, eliminated to protect a war that, we now know, was built on intelligence that didn't hold up. Dr. David Kelly knew the truth about Iraq's weapons. He knew the dossier had been dressed up. He knew enough to embarrass the most powerful men in 2 countries. And he tried, quietly, to tell a journalist the truth. He walked into the woods on a warm July afternoon and never walked out. And the evidence that might tell us what really happened to him is locked in a vault until almost everyone reading this is long gone. He tried to warn the world about a war built on a lie. And in the end, he became its first, and perhaps its most haunting, casualty on British soil. It's a quiet Friday evening in late April, 1996. A secluded weekend cottage sits on the water near Rock Point, Maryland, out where the Wecomico runs down toward the Potomac and the Chesapeake, where the willow trees lean over the shoreline, and the bay turns to black glass after sundown. Inside that house, an old man is making himself dinner. The radio's playing, his computer's on. It's the picture of a peaceful retirement. And by the time anyone looks inside that house again, the dinner will be half-eaten, the radio will still be playing, the computer will still be running, and the man will be gone. So will his canoe. The old man was William Colby, and he was not just anybody, he was the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Let's back up, because to understand why this accident doesn't sit right, you have to understand exactly who this man was. William Egan Colby, 76 years old, a legend in the shadow world. He started in the OSS, the wartime spy outfit that became the CIA, parachuting behind enemy lines in World War II. Colleagues called him a soldier priest, disciplined, devout, a master of unconventional warfare and tradecraft, the kind of man who is drawn toward danger and trained down to the bone to survive it. This is not a clumsy retiree. This is a man who spent decades staying alive in places designed to kill him. And he ran the CIA at its most explosive moment from 1973 to 1976, the Watergate years, the fallout from Vietnam, a time when the whole intelligence community was terrified of being dragged into the daylight. Now, here's the thing that matters most. When Congress started asking questions, William Colby made a choice that, in that world, was unforgivable. He compiled and handed over a document the agency would have killed to keep buried. They called it the Family Jewels, nearly 700 pages cataloging the CIA's darkest, most illegal operations, assassination plots against foreign leaders, illegal spying on American citizens, the MK-Ultra mind control experiments, the whole filthy backlog. Think about what that means. In the intelligence world, the number one rule, the golden rule, is silence. You take the secrets to the grave. And Colby took the secrets and handed them to Congress. To him, it was the only way to save the CIA, radical honesty before the whole thing collapsed. But to a lot of very dangerous men, old Cold Warriors and off-the-books operators, William Colby wasn't a reformer. He was a traitor. He'd betrayed the Brotherhood, and those men have long memories. Hold on to that, because it becomes important. So let's get back to that Friday night, April 27th, 1996. Earlier that evening, Colby was outside his vacation home, calmly watering his willow trees. A local caretaker and his sister saw him and stopped to chat. And by every account, this was a totally normal, lucid, relaxed conversation. They talked about the nice weather. They talked about the work Colby had done that day on his sailboat, moored over at the Cobb Island Marina. He was coherent. He was content. He gave off zero signs of distress, zero signs of confusion, nothing. Then he went inside to make dinner. And that's the last anyone saw of William Colby alive. Over the weekend, his wife, who he'd spoken to on the phone, gets concerned. Neighbors notice something's off. By Sunday, people come to check on him, and when they get inside that house, they walk into a scene that, frankly, makes no sense. The door is unlocked, the radio is still playing, his computer is still on, and his dinner is sitting right there, half-eaten. His car is parked in the driveway. Everything in that house says a man who was in the middle of a normal, quiet evening and simply stood up and walked out of it. But the canoe is gone. Now, this is where it gets strange. The official story, the one the authorities settled on pretty quickly, is this. The 76-year-old former spy chief decided, on a whim, on a freezing, pitch-black night, to push his dinner aside and take his canoe out alone onto the dark water. And while he was out there, he supposedly had a sudden medical event, a stroke maybe, or a heart attack. He fell into the water and drowned. The next morning, a local handyman out on the water with his wife and kids finds Colby's bright green canoe washed up against a little spit of land. And then a massive search begins. Coast Guard, boats, divers, over a week of searching. It takes 9 days. 9 days before his body finally turns up, washed onto the shoreline. No life jacket. Cause of death, officially, accidental drowning. Okay, let's stop right there. Because the second you actually think about this, the official story starts coming apart in your hands. Let's start inside the house. The half-eaten dinner, the running computer, the radio still going, the unlocked door. Does that look like the scene of a man who decided to go for a relaxing paddle? Think about how you'd actually do that. You'd finish your meal, or at least set it aside on purpose. You'd maybe turn the radio down. You'd grab a jacket against the cold. You'd get your gear together. Going canoeing is a small project. It's not something you launch into mid-bite and leave the lights on for. No, what that scene actually looks like is an interruption. It looks like a man whose evening was broken into. Someone interrupted in the middle of dinner by something or someone that pulled him away from the table and out of the house fast. A half-eaten meal isn't the start of a leisurely adventure. It's the fingerprint of a moment that got cut short. Now let's talk about this supposed canoe ride itself. It was night, genuinely dark, out on open water with no streetlights for miles. The water was freezing cold. And the man we're talking about is not some reckless tourist. This is William Colby, a trained OSS operative, a survivalist, a man who, by his entire psychological makeup and decades of training, was obsessive about risk and preparation. He knew those waters. He knew the Chesapeake tides are treacherous and can turn deadly. So you're telling me that this meticulous, safety-conscious, danger-trained 76-year-old man decided, out of nowhere, on a cold night in total darkness, to launch a tiny canoe onto open water, alone, without a life preserver? That's not a small thing to swallow. That's asking us to believe a man violated every instinct and every habit of a lifetime on the one night it killed him. But here's the detail that, for me, blows the whole accident out of the water entirely: the canoe. When that handyman found Colby's bright green canoe the next morning, it was full of sand, not a little splash of sand, filled with it. And the handyman said something crucial. He'd sailed right past that exact spot the day before, and there was no way that much heavy sand collects in a boat naturally, overnight. Colby's own family later had to physically shovel hundreds of pounds of sand out of that canoe just to salvage it. So ask yourself the obvious question: where did the sand come from? A canoe full of sand isn't an accident. It's a technique. Loading a small boat with heavy ballast is a crude, deliberate way to scuttle it, to sink it down into the water column and make it disappear. Somebody filled that canoe with sand to send it to the bottom. And here's the logic gap that no version of the accident story can close. A 76-year-old man having a sudden fatal stroke or heart attack does not stop, in his final moments, to load his canoe with several hundred pounds of sand before tumbling into the river. That is physically and humanly impossible. The sand had to be put there by someone else. The only reason to do it is to hide the boat, and the theory goes that whoever did it simply miscalculated the Chesapeake's tides, and instead of sinking, the sand-filled canoe washed ashore the next morning and gave the game away. And then there's the 9 days. Think about that delay. A body in a relatively contained stretch of water with the Coast Guard and search teams actively combing the area, and it takes over a week to find him. By the time they recovered Colby, the body had decomposed badly. And decomposition isn't just grim, it's convenient. Because advanced decomposition destroys the medical examiner's ability to screen for the subtle stuff, for synthetic paralytics, for untraceable agents that trigger a heart attack, for the chemical compliance drugs that intelligence services have used for decades to subdue a target without leaving a single defensive bruise. Those 9 days didn't just delay the funeral, they erased the chemistry of his final hours. So now line up everything we know. A man who had spent his life mastering the invisible operation, a man who broke the cardinal rule and exposed the agency's worst secrets, making lethal enemies in the darkest corners of the government, an interrupted dinner, an out-of-character night ride no trained survivalist would take, a canoe deliberately weighed down with sand, a body that surfaced too late to test for poison. And here's the uncomfortable thought experiment. If you wanted to murder a man and make it vanish into a tragic accident, if you needed the motive, the means, and the sheer professional expertise to stage something untraceable on dark water, who would be at the very top of your suspect list? Who, on this entire planet, is best trained to make a killing look exactly like an accident? The answer is the same kind of people Colby had spent 3 years exposing. Now, I have to be fair here. There's no smoking gun, no confession, and some of Colby's own family, looking at the same strange details, have quietly wondered whether it wasn't murder at all, but a staged, self-inflicted death, a deeply private man choosing to end things on his own terms and disguise it to protect his legacy. That's a real theory too, and it lives in the same shadows. But the official version, the cheerful retiree who paddled off into the freezing dark on a whim and conveniently drowned, that one just doesn't survive contact with the facts. William Colby spent his entire career as a ghost, a master of the cover story, the clean operation, the death that looks like something else. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how you make a man disappear without leaving a trace. And on a dark night on the Wicomico, it's entirely possible that the master of the invisible operation became the victim of a perfect one. The dinner was still on the table, the radio was still playing, and the one man who could have told us what really happened that night had spent his whole life making sure that men like him never talk.